political organization, and then it gathers thinkers from countries around the world in order to take political action to change the way, for instance, that we generate energy. The work underlying their conclusions, as I understand it, reflects a broad consensus of the scientific community in terms of analysis of CO2 impacts on the environment, the emission levels related to different forms of generation. So I think that my understanding of science is that you do enough research, you replicate the work, you find it replicable in other labs, and then you judge it to be an adequate description of what's going on. So everything climate change is very real, and that it's being I don't think anyone's saying the sole driver of it is CO2. It's CO2 and equivalent gases like methane has an impact, etc. But the greenhouse the greenhouse effect, as I understand it, is well understood, well documented, and emissions are driving up, enhancing the Earth's warming and helping drive climate change. So if you have other science suggests otherwise, I'm certainly always love to learn more, and I'd be happy to learn more about it. If we could talk after or now, whatever, and get some information online or offline.
Thank you. Harvey?
Yes, I want to, in observation, I remember when Champlain Valley was loaded with windmills, not to generate electricity, but pump water. And it's something that we've had historically in the valley and across the Northeast. I don't know, up until they had a good supply of electricity to pump water, wind was basically the primary power source we had. But you raised some good questions, and I'd love to hear more and talk to you some more about it, because we are making significant changes in what we're doing right now, and I want to make sure that we're not putting the money in the wrong place, that we're headed in the right direction with this. Everybody's kind of in tune to that. As far as future wind in Vermont, it's going to be a struggle, especially those on the ridges. I really support the smaller wind turbines that are in our valley, and I think one's larger than what you have, something more like what Spruce Farm has. That seems to make some sense. Part of the problem with those is building the grid to support that. They're on a three-phase line. They had that set up for their methane generation, so that was a perfect location for it. Quite a lot of the county isn't set up to handle that unless they just transmit it and that it's being used locally. But to get on the three-phase line, it's a much bigger deal. So thank you for bringing it up.
More questions?
So my name is George Gross, and I live here in Shoreham with Barb. And we actually have a fairly large deployment of solar in our house that actually powers our farm, freezers, and other equipment throughout the year. So on a net annual basis, we actually make as much solar power as we actually consume. To the question about the science underlying climate change, I know it's a hard read, but I've actually taken out the IPCC documents off the web and dove into them enough to understand them. My background is as a computer scientist, but it's written in language that can be read if you take the hard time that it actually is to read it. And the conclusion is pretty dire, actually. In October, they came out with an update addressed to the world community and all policymakers that basically says we're running out of runway. We have run out of runway. That in fact, if we do not turn the boat, we will lose this planet. So it's up to us, really all of us, to step up and acknowledge the cost is something we created ourselves, and do whatever we can to do a world that our children can live in.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Mark? You're next.
Mark Bowman, Addison, Vermont. I have a question about the DMV. I had problems getting my physical for the CDL, and they suspended my license because they did not have the physical form filled out in time by February 28th. Why do they suspend all driving instead of just for the commercial driving? The second question is, I went to the agency, the DMV in South Burlington to get the forms because I had to go to another doctor that did not have the forms because my doctor was out on leave. And the DMV office in South Burlington did not have the forms for me to take to the doctor. So that's the question I have on that. The other question I have is I got this notice from the tolls in New York State. Somebody got hold of my license plate from a car I haven't had for 2 years and is driving down the toll roads. I get a bill and I get told that I have to either pay it or show proof that I don't own the car, and you can't prove the negative, or they're gonna suspend my license in Vermont. I called the DMV and asked them why they would suspend my license, and they said if your license is suspended in any state, they have to suspend it in this state, and I have no judicial review of the state of Vermont's suspending my license. Why don't I have a legal right to contest this without having to go to New York to do it? Thank you.
Okay, some interesting questions.
These are clearly questions for Harvey, but so I don't know the answer to that. This sounds to me like sort of a common sense, a failure of some sort of common sense kinds of things, or but I'm happy to talk with you after, and then you know, one piece of constituent, I always say constituent service is not about getting special treatment from government. It's just getting fair, accurate, timely treatment. And it sounds like the system's not working in a reasonable way. If a form's missing, then you can't get it filled out in time and you lose your license. So let's talk after, and I'll get the details and follow up with DMV directly.
Harvey, do you want to make a comment?
Well, my comment is we need to talk because this isn't a legislative issue. This is an issue that the legislator created some laws, and it gives the DMV the right to develop some rules around those laws. And I don't know whether it's the Vermont rules or whether it's the New York rules that are causing you all a problem. It sounds like a little bit of both. So we need to discuss about it a little bit more, and I'd be happy to follow up with DMV.
Okay, more questions? Yes.
I'm Carolyn Schmidt from Whiting. I'd just like to ask both legislators a general question about what legislation that you're currently discussing do you think is the most interesting or the most important that you'd like to tell us about? Just sort of open question to both of you. Thanks.
Harvey?
Wow. We're both on the Natural Resources Committee. I'm on Natural Resources in the House, and Chris is chair of the Natural Resources in the Senate. And the one bill that I'm working on right now is reform or rewrite of the Act 250 law that we have, and that's huge. It's almost mind-boggling to try to get your mind around what we're doing, but basically it's reaching out, and it appears to me that Act 250 jurisdiction is going to cover most of Vermont and not just some large development projects, including forestry and agricultural operations, as well as, you know, in town. The one thing that stands out to me the most on that is I forgot the name of it, but it's the downtown centers, the designated downtown centers, And we only have, I think, 4 or 5 in Addison County that are there that will get some preferential treatment on there. But it's a very, very small area where they wouldn't necessarily have to go through the full-blown Act 250 process to be able to make some changes. But I give you an example that in the town of Bristol, you go to the stoplight, and it's 1 block either side of that stoplight, where there really isn't any opportunity to do any new growth and development. It was the designation for that designated downtown center was created so that you could have a tax incentives in order to make some improvements, you know, but there's no place to build in those areas. Virgins is basically Main Street, and it's only one house back from Main Street. It isn't, you know, to the next block. So it's a very small area. So if we're going to do that, we really need to include the areas that the towns have designated for growth and development, whether it be commercial or whether it be residential or mixed use. So, I mean, and that's only one little item in that bill, but it's a huge bill and we need to spend some time. Part of it has to do with climate change and cutting back on the greenhouse gases and making any future development responsible for taking that under consideration with carbon offsets. But I was thinking when we were talking carbon offsets, it would be for the actual construction and maintenance of those facilities. But it's all future traffic that might be visiting those developments. And I don't know how you do that. I mean, it's so big. I don't know how we're going to, I don't understand everything that's happening in the bill.
So before you sit down, Harvey, just what are the chances that this is going to be finished? We're in the mid-March right now.
We will know by the end of the week. We've got this week scheduled for continue marking it up, but I have raised a lot of questions, and I said as we go through marking it up, I want to have the right to go back once we understand the bill and ask further questions, take more testimony on it. So if they adhere to that, my guess is it isn't going to make crossover, so probably be a 2-year bill instead of a 1-year turnaround.
Okay. Senator Bray.
So Harvey just mentioned crossover, and for people who don't follow the legislative calendar all that closely, we have an agreement between House and Senate that basically at the midpoint of the session, any bill that the other side is going to be obligated to look at, they may not act on it, but at least look at, has to make crossover. So we try to, it's like air traffic control, so that we don't pile too many things on them at the very end and vice versa. So in our committee, there's 3 bills. I'll pick one to really talk about. We've voted out a clean water bill that will be on the floor shortly. We voted out a bill on PFAS, family of chemicals. PFOA is the most publicized one in this family of chemicals. We want to enhance protections for Vermonters. And we'll be voting out this week a bill on single-use plastics, so plastic bags. I'll double back to the PFAS bill. So these things are per and polyfluorinated alkanes, short carbon change molecules loaded up with fluorine. They're used in manufacturing. They're part of a process chemical related to making things like Teflon and water and oil-resistant coatings for things. So they've been used, they were developed starting in the late 1940s, and it turns out that they are, in research taking blood samples from around the world, people and animals, there's no blood they've discovered yet without PFAS chemicals attached to the proteins in blood serum. So it has become a ubiquitous compound, and it's a family. It's actually it's a family of 5,000 compounds. Vermont has regulated 5 that we've, as a result of the Bennington exposure. We've learned that they're carcinogenic in a variety of ways. And from a public health point of view, we said we want to make sure that Vermonters are not exposed to these carcinogens so we can start to understand where they are, how they travel, and start to regulate them from a public health point of view. As a result, you might recall that in Bennington, it was well water that was contaminated, roughly 400 wells. And so we set a standard in law for groundwater. But there are other ways you encounter water, surface water, and public water supplies. There still are no standards around PFAS chemicals in surface water or in public water supplies. So this bill creates public water supply standards for PFAS and then starts a process to identify how to regulate them broadly in the environment, so in surface waters. So I think it's probably the most important bill we're working on from a public health standpoint this year.
More questions? Yes.
Question.
Come ahead.
Hi, I was wondering, this is Barb Wilson from Shoreham, and I've been reading lately that we've started doing testing of the water in schools and a lot of lead is showing up. Does the water bill include any provisions for lead, or will that be maybe future legislation that is brought up? Because it was kind of alarming that we have so much lead.
Yes, so we did a pilot study last summer. 15 schools were tested for lead, and they found that there were some locations in every school that exceeded the lead standard. So I helped sponsor with some colleagues a bill to say, no one would expect faculty, staff, students to be exposed to an old-fashioned, well-documented toxin. And so the bill has already passed out of the Senate. I believe it was S40. Went over to the House. We're hoping that it will be acted on soon. And it does two things. One, it pays for testing at every school around the state. I think I need to dig into more of the details. Huntington Town Meeting, someone said, let's make sure we're including child care centers as well. So that's a piece of homework for me to do when I get back. And then it also says if you find problems, the state's going to help offset some of they're not paying the full cost, but we're going to help chip in on remediating. My understanding is for the most part, the problems are not that pervasive. I mean, there are levels of exceedance in many places, but a lot of them are related to solder in older faucet sets, so that replacing the faucet and getting rid of the lead solder will remove the immediate problem.
Thank you.
Okay. Come ahead.
I'm Dinah Bain from Bridport, and I have a completely different topic. I'd like to, last year when the feds changed all of the deductions and taxes and all that, Vermont tried to follow suit. One of the areas that they completely ignored is any kind of medical deduction. There are people who are going to be in deep trouble this year because they can deduct on the feds, but they can't do anything with it on the state. What are you guys going to do about it?
Representative Smith told me he's going to fix that when he gets so all I have to do is stand behind him. No, I was unaware, so thank you for bringing it up. I mean, part of the beauty of these breakfasts is you end up learning things while we're out and about. Sometimes what we learn are problems, and so I was not aware of that. I don't serve on finance anymore, so I don't know the kind of tax details, but I'm happy to take notes, follow up, and see what's going on in Vermont. Why, I would be surprised if it was entirely an oversight on someone's part not to carry it through, but maybe that's what happened. Maybe there's some sort of offsetting way of addressing it. I don't know. I'll be happy to look into it and get back to you.
If there is, I don't know it, and I do taxes for
Right,
AARP, tax aid, and there's nothing in any of the software that allows it to be put in. There, you did put in a credit for charitable contributions, but you didn't do anything for medical.
So I'll, after today's breakfast, if you can sort of write out an example of how it used to work and how it does work, that will put me in a better position to go ask the right questions back to him up here this weekend.
Yes, when we do a massive change and trying to respond in a short period of time from something that's happened in Washington and a law that's being changed, oftentimes mistakes are made. We've been known to go back and revisit those and correct some. Whether this is on the radar screen right now for the folks that are actually making those kind of decisions, I'm not sure, but you bringing it up, we'll make them aware that it's there.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions, and again, we're open to any topic. You don't have to stick to one topic or another. And if you, yes.
Luke Austin, Middlebury. At the Bristol Legislative Breakfast, Senator Hardy talked about the difficulty in balancing interests. That's the challenge of being a legislator. That same balancing of interests goes on in Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Earlier in the pregnancy, the interests are towards the mother, the woman. Later in the pregnancy, they are more towards the potential life or the state interest in protecting that life. Casey had the bright line at viability, which I believe is 24 weeks. That protection is present in the New York Reproductive Health Act signed by Governor Cuomo. What are the chances that that could be put onto age 57 in the Senate?
So I can't give you a precise answer on what the plans of the Senate are, because we were in sprint mode getting ready for crossover and hunkered down on the work of natural resources in one committee and GovOps in the other. We're not handling H57. It's been referred to another committee, and I'd be happy to look in, check in with that committee and see what kind of discussion there is around any kind of potential changes to the bill. So I just don't know enough to answer your question precisely.
The question, I guess, also is it subject to crossover? Because there's some special rules in some committees that committee bills don't have to suffer crossover. So where would it go?
Sure. So H57 has made its way to the Senate, passed the House already, I think maybe 2 weeks ago. So it's made crossover. It is safe. The special rule bit you're talking about is because so many bills have to go through the Finance Committee and through the Appropriations Committee, they get an extra week extension on bills. So, for instance, the Senate bill needs to be out of our committees, and if it's going to go to Finance or Approps, it needs to be out of Senate Natural or another committee, and to those committees by the end of the coming week. Then it has one extra week in that committee before Finance and Approps has to. So they have a little extra time because they see so much traffic this time of year.
Don't go away. You mentioned when you were talking before that about crossover that this was the midpoint.
Right.
Does that mean we have just as many months left after Friday?
I wish I'm a little embarrassed because I was going to get out the calendar and count actual weeks to see exactly where we are.
It'd be June, the first week in June.
Yeah, so it's right. It's a little beyond midpoint. In general, I think we budget for 18 weeks for the legislature. We aim to adjourn in 16. There's usually, there's some wrestling, closing bills and closing gaps at the end. And we usually adjourn in 17. So a typical year will be start the first week of January, finish roughly the end of first, beginning of second week of May. So we adjourned late last year, roughly May 23rd, something like that. And then we got called back in. So I'm hoping we don't have a special session again.
All Harvey, did you want to make any comments on the original question?
Well, I'll just say that H57 was a very emotional and controversial bill. For the first time in all the years that I've been in the legislature and have been dealing with abortion issues, for the first time ever, I had quite a few pro-choice supporters ask me to vote no on this bill because they felt that it went too far. So that tells you where it is. So I'm glad you brought up the issue and put a little pressure on the Senate.
Okay, more questions. Everybody's quiet this morning. It must be. We had a week of off for town meeting, and legislators typically visited town meetings across their region or their area. Was there a major issue that came up at town meetings that you'd like to tell us about? Even if it wasn't your issue. Harvey or Chris? Was there something that came up at town meetings?
Well, there's nothing like controversy to make something attract attention at town meeting. And it turns out that although for Addison County as a whole, Act 46 with the school mergers has worked quite well, at least, let's say in terms of actions. Many school districts have all been merged, but on diagonal corners of the Senate district, Orwell being one case and Huntington being another, both those towns did not go ahead with Act 46 mergers, although Orwell has been pushed into one by the Agency of Education, and Agency of Education has also told Huntington that it has to merge. Huntington is has taken a suit, brought a suit against the state and the Agency of Education saying it doesn't believe it should be forced to merge. And there's a group of 33 towns or school districts that are also bringing a suit forward. There's for people in those two towns, Act 46 is at least a majority in those two towns. They went through, in the case of Huntington, 4 votes no on merging. I think Orwell had 3 such votes. And so there's a lot of unhappiness that they voted one way and then they see the state and the Agency of Education moving forward and pushing them into a merger that they decide, they don't believe is in their own best interest. I voted for Act 46 4 years ago, I think it was. There were provisions in there that looked as though they were going to provide for enough local control, alternatives to a straight-up merger. They were called alternate governance structures, but very few have been approved by the Agency of Education. You couldn't really see how they were going to be interpreted in the bill, but they were described as off-ramps, and I think I'm one of the legislators who feels as though the off-ramps were less available to towns than many legislators thought. The other thing, and I think this was a flaw in the way the bill was constructed, frankly, I don't think we should ever put citizens in a position where they come to a legally warned vote and then are told after the fact that their vote, in fact, did not drive the decision. So people are voting not to merge, and then they're told they're going to be merged. And I think it's created, some real bitterness about what kind of a vote was that. And frankly, I share that concern. In government operations, this is one of the issues I brought up, that we should look at how questions are presented and make sure we don't do that to ourselves again, because I think it was a mistake. Don't ask a question if you don't want to hear the answer.
Harvey?
Yeah, I actually wasn't able to stay for the discussion at the town meetings, and of course, with our school consolidations, we really don't have that school discussion, and we do have a ballot item that was there. I counted the ballots for Mount Abe District, and wow, I think we counted them 6 times. There was 2 reasons for that. One is they had 2 questions on the same piece of paper, and so it was either yes or no, so we had to separate them out for Article 1, and then once we counted those a couple times, then we had to break it out for Article 2. But it was very interesting that out of all the votes cast, it passed by 13 votes. So I think there's a lot of people that are really concerned, and I don't think it's necessarily concerned about educating our children. It's about being able to pay the property taxes to fund that. And it's getting to be quite a hurdle for a lot of people. That's what I hear when I'm out in the community. And so I don't know what the answer to that is. Consolidation was being touted as being a way to save some dollars, and maybe in the long run it will. I wasn't convinced that my constituency was going to see a huge reduction in their tax burdens to support education. And unlike Chris, I voted against it just because I was very uncomfortable where it was headed. I think, you know, for the town's Addison Central unit, and that's part of my district, they were already in the process having the communications, and they had for a couple of years prior to us doing Act 46, and I think that's the way that it should proceed. I think that our towns, our school boards, our citizens should make a determination of how they want to proceed with their educational system, and I applaud that Addison Central District for taking a real leadership role in working to make that goal, or to meet that goal.
So have either of you heard of, since the vote was so close in that district and so close in Virgins, has anybody heard whether there's going to be a recount?
I have not, but if they recount, good luck. They were really close.
Okay. Heidi, you're next.
I'll follow up on this topic a little bit. Heidi Willis from Salisbury. And I'm just curious if there is any kind of plan or structure to follow up and evaluate the impacts of Act 46. So rather than just kind of pass the law and then just say, okay, but is there, and let it go, is there a plan, say, in 5 years to look and see what the impacts have been on school districts, on finances? And my concern has been, and I'm a retired teacher, this is a rock and a hard place. I'm not sure what the answers are for this, but my concern is that the consolidation of school districts has impacted town meetings and will be impacting our sense of community. We've just finished with town meeting. In Salisbury, we vote everything now by Australian ballot. So there's a little group of us that are working hard to make town meeting inviting, try to get people out for town meeting, but if there's nothing that people are going to be doing that has any teeth, if there's no meaningful action there, it's become basically an informational meeting. And I think there are lots of other reasons why town meeting is declining, but I just would encourage that there be some kind of plan to evaluate the impacts of Act 46, both educationally and in the wider community.
Thanks, Heidi. You've expressed the concern of many people. I don't know of any review of Act 46 that's being directed by the legislature, but it is being reviewed by the court system. There's been several challenges to the system as we have now. So what the outcome of that is going to be, I don't know, but I think we should review it. I think we should set up an opportunity to reevaluate what we're doing, and also add to that, what are some of the options we would have moving forward if Act 46 isn't the answer.
I mean, 5 years down the road, things have had a chance to shake out, and you look and you see, what's happened in terms of education for kids, what's happened in terms of, has it reduced taxes or not, what's happened in terms of wider impacts. It takes a while for that kind of thing to shake out, but.
Right, and we should be doing that on an ongoing basis as well. So thank you.
Chris?
Thanks for the question about following up on Act 46. I don't know if there is already a process set up to monitor how things change, but I think that it's a good idea. The legislature is, I think, somewhat prone to coming up with new laws and moving forward onto the next good idea without pausing and spending I think, adequate time looking at the impact of prior work. I know that there's been so much change in education in the last decade that there is, we've heard, I'm not on Senate Education anymore, but I still hear enough from teachers and the teaching community, like, please don't come up with another big change for us. We would like to settle in and operate under the, let the past changes get operating, see what's working well and not well, think about making adjustments, don't add on yet another mandate or something along those lines. Anecdotally, on the town impacts of taking school votes out of town meeting votes, would people be showing up? I know that was a concern people had. But so a non-scientific sample, as in going to 10 meetings, I would say in general they were as well attended as in prior years where there was a school vote.
Okay, that got some questions.
Go
first.
You first.
Yes, I worked in a small school up in the Mountain Valley there up in Rochester for 10 years. When I started, there were 80 in the school, enrolled in the high school, and when I left 10 years later, there were about 65. It was not much fun. The young teachers see that there's no career there. They bail. All the energy looked like an old age home in the faculty. And there was one student who liked to point that out. And then, your generosity just always amazed me. I had as few as 2 students in the classroom. 2 students. So, and then I would go to a class with 4 students. Okay, I had served on a school board for 5 years. No union school would ever run a class with just 2 students in it. So I got whatever I asked for. Your generosity was amazing, all right? The network administrator claimed we were probably the most expensive school in the entire country, all right, with the per pupil spending. But this fey mood would come over us every once in a while. How can we fix this school? How are we going to keep this school alive? And we'd set up all kinds of fantastic programs. And then look, there's only 6 kids in grade 2. Okay? Kindergarten, they're having trouble getting 7 or 8 kids. All right? There are no children. So my question is, I get contradictory information on population trends in Vermont. Are we going up or are we going down? And where have all the children gone?
So I think Vermont population is increasing very slightly, very slow population growth. There are schools that I visited this year that are seeing increasing student counts and others that are decreasing. So I think it really depends where you are. Sometimes there are, my sense is that parents will pick a town if they know there's a particularly strong school. So some schools draw students in and people literally move to that town in order to have their kids go K through 6, for instance, in the local elementary school. But that's not true. So I think overall, we're still seeing student population declines in total members. State population overall is growing, but very slowly.
Okay.
Hi. Kind of getting back to property tax. One of the things I heard really loud and clear when I was running, because I had run for rep in our district, was property taxes are so high. And oftentimes we basically, and it really seemed to impact folks that are retired or elderly, they have their property, that's their basically savings, you know, it may be their land. And oftentimes we kind of counter and say, well, we have the Homestead Act, that's supposed to protect you. And I wondered why wasn't that working, because in like Orwell, they had quite a major increase in their property tax. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that what is happening is your homestead is based on the previous year. So if in fact, you know, federal income tax return, so if in fact in the next year you get a $3,000 increase, your bill does go up by $3,000, and then it'll readjust the following year when you submit your your income tax again. So to me, for someone that's retired on a fixed income, that could be a big, big deal to have to come up with an extra $2,000, $3,000, and I listened to story after story where that's happening. So I believe this is a change that we need to look at. Number two is, I believe in the previous session, there had been some effort on changing how we fund schools, you know, and move it away from the property tax model. And I'm wondering, and I know that kind of stalled, and I think I had heard that maybe that had started up again. I apologize for not researching and finding the bill number, if that's true. Maybe you can guide me, what's the best committee to go look at to help narrow my search on that. But the homestead, I think there's a flaw in it, and you know, for the most part, I think it works good. I just think when there is a major uptick, then we need to weigh, you know, to protect people that are in fixed income anyway, so that you don't see that major uptick for that 1 year that it would happen, because it's you know, based on the previous year.
You bring up a big issue.
I know I do.
And, but it's one that we need to kind of take a look at. I think the first place to go would be the Education Committee, because these are kind of things that they look at, and then after the Education Committee works on something, then it'll go to the Ways and Means Committee, because they're the committee that comes up with the funding, the taxes that we need. But I know just before I left, I talked to one of the members of the House Appropriations Committee, and they currently have, and they're not going to get funded, but they currently have $800 million worth of new proposals that people want. And that's not sustainable, it's not something we can do, so there's a lot of people who are going to be disappointed with the results of the committee, especially if they stay somewhere within cost of inflation, you know, for their budget increases. It's going to be tough, and I applaud the folks that are serving on that committee for dealing with some really tough issues, and sometimes it can become real emotional, and they have to really pay attention to the dollars and stay within whatever the range is that they've set for themselves as far as the growth of the budget can happen.
Thanks.
So.
And related to the homestead, I mean, what would be a good approach for me to get that more visible? Because I think we kind of didn't realize that was happening. You know, that the year that it goes up, because it's based on your previous year, you know, so it seems like there needs to be a way to address that, so it isn't adversely causing people to put their houses on the market, which was what was happening in Orwell.
Yeah, I mean, that is a tough issue, and I didn't realize that it changed that much. I mean, I get that homestead as well, and mine never varies anywhere near the amount that you just described. So I didn't know how large the problem is, and if it changes that much on your property, then I'm sure there's a lot of other people that are facing something very similar to it.
And I think it's, you know, if something major is happening in that town where all of a sudden, like in Orwell, there was a major kind of uptick. That's the only time you see it. For the most part, none of us really see it because it is small changes when the tax rate doesn't change that much, and you can deal with it. But it's when a major thing happens, and I know people that actually put their house on the market because they just, I can't afford this, I gotta move.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think I would ask the same thing, and I could help write up a description of what was in year one versus what was in year two, so that there's an illustration of how that system seems not to be working the way that people, including me, thought it was working. And then that's the kind of thing that on the House side would be brought to Ways and Means, the attention of Ways and Means, and in the Senate, I would take that to the Chair of Finance and say, you know, are you aware of how this is actually playing out in these cases? Because maybe there's an adjustment that can be made to do smoothing. Yeah, I mean, there are provisions already built in. I know, for instance, that looks back 3 years, and it's in order to try to have a moderating, any kind of trend up or down will be moderated because you're averaging over time as opposed to just responding to the immediate year. So maybe there's something that needs further adjustment.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Dan Longer, New Haven. There's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and I feel like this is a Groundhog Day movie. You know, we keep talking about it. All this stuff is subterfuge. It's we're talking about all the issues with consolidation of schools, property taxes. That's 80%. We're talking about there's colleges closing. We're not bringing students in. We're not bringing children in. We're not bringing families in. Our unemployment's a little under 4%. It mimics what we see nationally. We're maxed out right now, but we have the attitude of Montpelier, no offense guys, that big business is bad. And unless we start bringing families in to work for large businesses, we're spiraling, we're in a death spiral. So, my question to Chris and Harvey is, what are we doing to bring big businesses into Vermont?
I don't know that we have a program designed necessarily to bring big businesses into Vermont. Vermont is, by the numbers, you know, something like 90% of employees work for a small business. So I think that's the strength really of our business culture, is that it is many small businesses, some of which grow up. So if you go down Exchange Street, for instance, there are many things that were smaller businesses. They start as one or twosies, and I can talk about Vermont Coffee. You know, it used to be Paul Ralston roasting at the Bristol Bakery on his own. Then there was one person, then he moved down the street and it was 4 people. And then he moved into Middlebury, and now I think it's 30. The same kind of story goes on at Otter Creek Brewing, at the Vermont Aquaviti Company, you know, all up and down that street. So I think part of what has served Vermont well is not to necessarily lean on trying to provide any attraction to bring in a large employer. I served on the Vermont Economic Progress Council, which does grants to help attract and retain businesses. And one of my conclusions was that Vermont has the smallest checkbook of all 50 states. We can't write big checks to bring big businesses in, and right now, business that looks to locate or relocate pits one jurisdiction versus another. They want tax breaks, incentives, etc. We just don't have that much money to throw around and trying to attract those sorts of businesses. The other thing is, if someone's attracted once to the best deal, they can be attracted twice to the best deal. Those don't tend to be the businesses that necessarily stick around. They come in on an incentive, and they're open to better incentives and open to leaving. So I think the healthy part of Vermont's economy is that we have many, many small businesses and a lot of entrepreneurs. I look at Farm to Plate, which I'm familiar with, you know, rebuilding our food system. So In the years since 2009, we've added 7,700 jobs in that farming food sector, 842 new businesses, and receipts are up for the sector as a whole over $2.5 billion. So, and that's billion with a B. So we have the ability to grow business on, I'd say, on a Vermont scale, and the successful businesses that I've seen are paying attention to Vermont culture, which is usually high quality, the value-added part of the world of food, and so I think we should play to our strong suit. I don't think we'll ever find another IBM, and if we were talking to them, we're not going to write them a check big enough to get them to come.
Wow, this is a tough issue, but over the last 20 or 30 years, we've done very little to bring, large businesses to the state or even maintain the ones that we have. I can list all kinds of numbers about businesses that have left or they've made their expansion in other areas. I agree with Chris that our local businesses, small entrepreneurs, mom and pop shops have done well, but a lot of them are struggling, but they also are very dependent on folks that are doing well because they need to have most of the products that they sell are locally, especially our microbreweries, our innovative cheese that a lot of the farmers are doing. They need customers, and the customers need to have some money in their pocket to do that, to be able to support that kind of business. And I find that really struggling when I talk to the farm community. Maybe the numbers have grown the way that Chris has said, but a lot of those folks that are actually developing those product lines are really finding it very difficult financially to operate. And some of them are doing well, some of them are really struggling. So, and I know when I was on the House Ag Committee, we would have people come in and they made a real effort to come in. You could tell they were hardworking people. Their hands were callous, there was a little bit of dirt ground into their skin, and you could tell just by looking at them that they were putting everything they possibly could into making this work. And then after they did that for 5 or 6 years, they just said, boy, we're just not going to make it. This is where our love is. This is what we'd really like to do, but we can't make it. I need more than $1.65 in my pocket at the end of the week. And so this is a real struggle for that community. So even though that community is growing, it's fragile.
Barb Wilson again. I worked for a large corporation for 38 years, and to get a large corporation to come here, you have to have ready workforce. Vermont doesn't have that. They're going to go where they can easily get people to fill the specialized jobs that they have. So that's why places like New Jersey are so popular, because it's a big melting pot and there's lots of people to pull upon. The other thing that's really happening in the large corporations, my entire team, by the time I finally left, which is why I retired early, was offshore to the Ukraine, right? So just because you might have a large company that has come here, their incentive is to return the maximum investment over to their board of directors and what have you. And so many of our jobs that we thought were so specialized are going to be offshored. And it's the lowest cost provider is, wherever the cheapest labor workforce is going to take those jobs. It was people 20, 30 years that had worked for me, basically were put out on the street. The other thing my observation, having gone to so many doors, is that people can't fill the jobs that they have here. There's, especially in the trades, I mean, people are just struggling so hard to get people to fill those jobs, and they're good jobs. You can actually make some money, you know, in a specialized, you know, plumber, what have you. And so I really do think we need to look at our education system and make sure that we're not downplaying trades and that kind of education. It's just as important as going off to college and help kids at an early age, not after they graduate from high school, you know, like in middle school, directing them, you know, well, this is a career path. You're more in the technical side, awesome, so let's go this way versus college prep. And I think that would go a long way to help solve some of our job issues. Let's invest in Vermonters first and make sure that we're training people based on the type of education opportunities and job opportunities that Vermont is going to be able to sustain. I think that would go a long way.
You bring up a lot of really good, valid points. And I'm just going to focus on one, because I agree with most of what you said. But a lot of the larger companies here, you know, are looking for really well-trained, technical type people that, you know, are coming in. And they can attract them, but they pay less than they would in surrounding states and in surrounding areas. But what really turns them off the most is the cost of housing. And a lot of folks coming in and find out what it costs to own a home and maintain a home here, they kind of get turned away. And if we start explaining to them about what you had talked about earlier about you know, having your homestead exemption or your homestead declaration, and that gets too complicated for them. They want to know that their tax bill is going to be X, and they don't want to go through all kinds of formulas to get to X.
Exactly.
And so I've talked to quite a few large businesses here in Vermont that is a big challenge for them, is drawing in the kind of talent that they need in order to do it. And then there's the other piece of bringing in the talent at a lower level, which could go through our trade schools and get there. And we haven't ignored it, but we haven't put an emphasis on it over the years. And a lot of people feel that, well, if you're going to get any place, you need to go to a college, get a liberal arts degree in something that doesn't really prepare you for that workforce. So, I mean, this is going to be intergenerational change if that's where we're headed.
Mark?
Mark Bowman in Addison. I'm a farmer in Addison. And I think the problem we have is death by 1,000 cuts. My brother and I wanted to start a business selling corn for people to use for fuel. And the biggest obstruction that we had was the state of Vermont rules. They wrote stuff in, the bureaucracy wrote, the bureaucrats or whatever you want to call them, wrote in final rules that made our selling a product for fuel basically uncompetitive, unable to meet their requirements. I know of a number of people that run medium-sized businesses that are thinking of moving out of the state. I look at all the water quality regulations that are being put in, and I know some of them are counterproductive, and I can talk to the people up at A&R, and it's like it goes in one ear and out the other without encountering anything in between. So it comes down to the fact that when my brother and I decided we were going to farm, my older brother said, why would you want to farm in Vermont? They're only going to treat you like dumb peasants up here. Go to some other place where they'll treat you like respected business people. I've been thinking a lot about that in the last 20 years, and if I had to do it again, I'd be farming in another state. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. You brought up a big issue, and it goes back to, I'm going to relate it back to Act 250, that bill that we're working on now. And historically, agriculture and forestry has been allowed to function without going through a lot of red tape. I mean, they have to follow all their water quality. In the agriculture community, it's the required agricultural practices. They have to do all those kind of things, and so they're pretty heavily regulated as it is. They have, if they ship milk, they have to go through the milk. You have to get a license to do that. You have to be inspected to do that on a regular basis. And it used to be, I've been out of it for a while, but you used to have wherever the market was that you were selling to, plus the state would come in and inspect you. So it wasn't easy. You have safe handling requirements, humane handling requirements for the animals that you raise and operate. But now under this Act 250 bill, if you have a significant natural resource on your area, which would be a wetland, would be one criteria. And if you look around right when you go home, I want you to look at the landscape, and any one of those hay fields out there, cornfields, could be a wetland. I mean, we don't know where it is until it's delineated. So that's a big issue for the agriculture community and the forestry community, because it's not a place where you can see the class 2 wetland, like Cornwall Swamp out in Dead Creek. All those are pretty easily identified. What people don't understand is we're talking about right out that window. You could be looking at a wetland. And that's going to be really difficult for the farm and forest community. If you have a slope of more than 15%, it would draw you into Act 250. If you have depth to bedrock, I don't know what that depth to bedrock is, that brings you into Act 250. If you have flood hazard area, so all the folks that would be on the river bottom land that are there, they would all have to come under Act 250 unless we make some modifications to it. So what you just said is real, but it's getting worse. And I'm really beside myself in the legislature trying to figure out how we can bring some common sense to making, some changes to Act 50 and control our growth. And when Act 250 was first put in place, there were very few towns that had any town planning or zoning. Now, all of the Addison County towns have planning and zoning bylaws to help with growth. And yet, it looks like that's going to be somewhat ignored, and it's still required to go under Act 250. So I'm very concerned in the direction we're going, and I hope it takes us a couple years to get there, because it's not going to be an easy solution, and it's very difficult. Carbon offset, greenhouse gases, that's all part of Act 250. Air quality, water quality, I mean, they should be, looked at and required, but should we have the agriculture community regulated by a panel of 3 individuals that don't have any concept whatsoever what it takes to grow a crop or maintain a farming operation? That's a huge concern for me.
Okay. We have plenty of time for more questions. If there aren't any, I could ask a few, I suppose, but go ahead.
Okay.
And you give us your name again.
Andrew Pizzullo from Millbury. Okay, attracting young people to the state. How about that, what is that, S38? College tuition? Is that the one? Where does that stand? Because that seems like a really good way to get young workers and young people to Vermont. However, last semester, just before class started, this young woman announced community college in Vermont is the most expensive community college in the 50 states. And I flunked her right there on the spot. Okay, top student. Just kidding. So everybody knows, they all know, the kids know. Why would they come here to go to college? Is there any movement on the college bills?
Okay. Any answers?
So I'm not in education anymore, so I haven't been in the room to hear the discussions, but I know that bill has been discussed. As you can imagine, the rub is the bill for providing that, tuition, for instance, free tuition for in-state colleges, I think is the concept. And I think the tab for that per year is in the tens of millions. So it could be an excellent investment. But I'm not sure, honestly, what the likelihood is that those kind of dollars will be found. The challenge for Vermont higher education, I think in general, is that it depends on the year, but we're either 49th or 50th as in lowest level of support in our state budget to our state university and state colleges. And that trend, we were already in since the 60s, the percentage has gone down, 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 and where it's just a very low level of support. It makes the colleges and universities highly tuition dependent, and that's the only other way they can bring in revenue. So they have the state colleges and the state university both have some of the highest tuition rates in the nation. I know that I used to UVM, I was a trustee for 6 years, so I knew the numbers then. So these numbers are 4 years out of date. I don't think they probably changed all that much. UVM does do a lot of scholarship grants, so that 45% of Vermonters attended UVM tuition free. So that's only part of the bill. You also have, room, board, housing, books, etc. But I think at least at UVM, where I'm familiar with the numbers, there are a lot of grants given to Vermonters to help them attend, but still, it's expensive when you add on all the non-tuition expenses on top of that.
Heidi?
We have time.
Sure.
Heidi Willis again from Salisbury, and I'll just pivot a little bit. Last couple of years, around this time or earlier, the governor kind of proposed some surprise budget requests, and my sense was from different comments from what I'd read was that the governor's office was having a difficult time working with the legislature. So I'm hoping there's been a learning curve, and I'm just curious if there's been more communication with the governor's office, with the House and the Senate, and what your sense is on that working relationship.
There's a much greater realization that he's not in control. So he better darn well be talking with the legislative as they're going through the process. And I've got to tell you that what he did the last 2 years surprised all of us, even from his own party, because we weren't aware. We'd been in constant communications with them, and then all of a sudden they put this on the table, and it was tough to deal with. And so I'm hoping that he learned the lesson that you need to communicate and be in contact with those and negotiation all through the process. And I'm just optimistic that he has.
I was going to say, have you seen any indication of that?
Well, I know that their staff have been working with different pieces of legislation, trying to get their position out there and explained and have it part of the discussion, so that's a good part. But as I say, on the education funding piece that he changed around, at the end of the last session, that kind of surprised us. So I don't know what he's up to this year, but we are talking with him, and Chris is from a different party than I am, so maybe he has a different view.
Well, I have a good news report. I mean, I think we all, one of the reasonable expectation every Vermonter, I think, should have is that everyone elected to Montpelier, regardless of party, does their very best to work together to get the best possible work done. And I'd say in the Senate, I've seen that kind of thing. I quit keeping track, but my first 2 years in the Senate, we never had a single party line vote in the 2 years. It does not tend to be party driven. You're on committees, they are your colleagues on a committee, and your party affiliation really has almost nothing to do with how you're thinking about the problem. You're just trying to get to an answer. There has been, I'd say, a big improvement from my point of view, Last year, I had a clean water funding bill in, S-260. We talked about it right here in this room a year ago. And the governor threatened to veto with this very terse sort of hard to understand potential objection. I asked for, the Senate had voted that bill through unanimously, so I asked for a written explanation to our colleagues. If you don't get that kind of feedback, how can you adjust a bill? If someone's threatening a veto, that's something you really want to hear, understand, and be able to respond to. 3 requests for in writing where I couldn't get a response. Then we scheduled the Secretary of Administration to provide testimony in committee. She didn't show up. She refused to come to committee. So that was a shock to me, that to have one branch of government stiffing the other, even in just terms of talking and explaining. That was a low point for me. This year we've had Agency of Natural Resources in the committee every day as we work through the PFAS bill and the Clean Water bill. They have been our steady, good working partners. So it's been a night and day switch, and it's really welcome, and I think it's what every Vermonter should expect, that regardless of branch of government, we all pull together to get the job done.
It's good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our program. I just want to remind folks that are both here and in our listening audience that the Addison County Farm Bureau is sponsoring a meeting tomorrow from 11 to 2 at the VFW in Middlebury for dairy farmers to protect yourself against decline in quarterly revenue from milk sales. There will be some discussion of decisions that dairy farmers need to make and how to apply, and to take a look at what the final revenue guarantee is, and just the milk business in general. Addison County Farm Bureau is sponsoring that. It begins at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's 11 to 2 at the VFW on Exchange Street in Middlebury. So let me remind you that also that next week is the governor's breakfast, and the governor will be here. It's going to be at the American Legion in Middlebury, and we hope that you can all join us, and please tell your friends to please come out for that meeting. The governor will be there a few minutes after we start, so you'll have an opportunity to talk to your legislators in depth about any issues, and then the governor will come and you'll have at him while he's there. And it's very important when we have questions like this that you come out and ask the governor questions. Our Addison County legislative breakfasts each week are brought to you by the Bridport Grange and the Addison County Farm Bureau, and we thank you very much for coming out. There is a donation jar as you leave the building. If you'd like to put $1 in there, we would very much appreciate it. It helps offset some of the costs of our program during the legislative session. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.